Welcome class to chapter 23. We just have two chapters left that we'll get through, and they both kind of focus on the environment and our relationship with the environment as humans. We'll first start to define some terms like ecosystem, biosphere. We'll look at how energy flows through the ecosystems, some of the chemical cycles, and a look at biodiversity. And again, looking at how the environment relates to humans. So ecology is the study of interactions between organisms and their environment. Earth as an ecosystem, there's no source of new materials. So many materials cycle between organisms and between living and non-living components. And we'll go over those cycles at the end. Energy always comes from the sun. It can be captured by green plants and transferred from organism to organism through trophic levels or food web levels. So here's at the look at our ecosystem of the Earth. You can see how it's mostly covered by water. A biosphere is a part of Earth where life exists, and it consists of many ecosystems. An ecosystem are organisms in a specific geographic area and their physical environment, and a community is all of the living species in an ecosystem that can potentially interact. So you should be familiar with these terms, and moving down, we get to population, all of the individuals of the same species. A niche is an organism's role in the ecosystem, and these can include all the physical, chemical, and biological factors that keep the organism healthy. And a habitat is the place where an organism lives, so that'll be part of its niche. A sequence of changes in species composition of a community over time is called ecological succession. And there can be primary or secondary. Primary succession occurs where no previous community existed, so we call these pioneer species. And eventually a climax community will form. So these are first living things to invade an area. And we can see them here. This thin mat of lichen is helping break down bare rock, beginning soil formation. After soil begins to formulate, we'll have plants appear, and then we'll have mature trees appear. So the lichen is the primary succession. Secondary succession occurs when an existing community is cleared and undergoes a series of events, leading once again to a climax community. Soil is present at the start, and the initial invaders would be grasses, weeds, and shrubs. And we can see here, these are different types of ecosystems: the temperate deciduous forest, how much rainfall they receive per year, and what kind of species are living in them: temperate grasslands, the desert, taiga, and tropical rainforest. So all different types of ecosystems. Immediately after a fire, there's no signs of visible life. In the following spring, young plants appear and begin the stages of secondary succession. So showing the cycle of ecological succession. Energy is supplied by the sun. It enters the living world as photosynthetic organisms trap the sun's energy and transform it into glucose during photosynthesis. And all of our plants do this. A trophic level is one of the feeding levels in the food web or a food chain that we'll talk about. Producers are photosynthesizers. They form the lowest trophic level. So our producers will always be plants, and consumers use energy stored by the producers. There'll be higher trophic levels because they will feed on the producers. Consumers can be grouped whether they eat plants, those are herbivores. They'll be primary consumers because they'll be at the level right above those producers, the plants. Carnivores are secondary and tertiary because they'll feed on animals, herbivores, or other carnivores that will eat the plants. Omnivores eat both plants and animals, and decomposers consume dead organic material for energy. They release this inorganic material that can be used by producers. And this is just a look at a really simple food web or food chain, looking at the different trophic levels. Producers use the energy from the sun to produce plant material. Primary consumers consume producers, so we'll see a lot of insects in the primary consumer level, or small mammals that would feed on grass. A secondary consumer are carnivores that feed on herbivores, and a tertiary consumer are carnivores that feed on secondary consumers. A food chain is a linear sequence. It's simplistic. It depicts feeding relationships, whereas a food web shows how many organisms are involved and how they eat at several different trophic levels. The food web is a more realistic pattern. So we can see here a tertiary consumer, a secondary consumer. Let's look at a human. So this is just a picture of a simple food web. How here are producers, whether they're algae, grain, or vegetables. And our primary consumers can be fish feeding on algae, chicken feeding on grain, or humans feeding on vegetables. Secondary consumers can be the tuna fish, a larger fish feeding on smaller fish, or humans feeding on the chicken, or the tertiary consumer can also be the human feeding on the larger fish. So this is a food chain, more simplistic, whereas a food web includes many different species involved and how they all interact with each other. And you can see that here. The green arrows show the transfer of energy from a producer. The red arrow shows the transfer of energy from the primary consumer. Blue shows the energy transfer from secondary consumer, and the yellow arrow shows the transfer of energy from a tertiary primary consumer. You can see here that if one part of the food chain is broken, or the food web, there can be drastic effects. So for example, if we overfish our oceans and we get rid of all of the small fish, we'll have algae, plankton, just explode in what we call algae blooms because there are no fish to feed off of it and control that population. When we have too much algae or plankton, that can kill some of the plant life within the water. Energy is lost when it's transferred from one trophic level to the next. This just means that about 10% of energy available at one trophic level is transferred to the next. And this is why ecosystems rarely have more than 4 or 5 trophic levels because energy is lost. Only the energy converted to biomass is available to the next higher trophic level. And biomass is the dry weight of an organism. So we have food eaten by a herbivore. He undergoes cellular respiration, so much energy is lost by heat. Also, a lot of energy is lost by its death, defecation, excretion, which will provide energy to decomposers. So only about 10% of energy from the chicken actually goes to carnivores. Ecological pyramids are diagrams that compare certain properties in a series of related trophic levels. We have a pyramid of energy and a pyramid of biomass. 2 lessons from ecological pyramids: non-degradable substances accumulate to higher concentrations in organisms at higher trophic levels, and more humans could be nourished on a vegetarian diet than on a diet containing meat. And this is a lot of the reason why vegetarians propose this, because for environmental reasons, it takes a lot less energy to provide food for a vegetarian than it does for someone who eats meat. So this is a look at energy in calories from producers and showing how much energy is lost as we go up each trophic level. Magnification is the tendency of non-degradable chemicals to become more concentrated in organisms in each successive trophic level. And this can be true if we talk about mercury concentration. If mercury is not that concentrated in phytoplankton or zooplankton, it'll become more concentrated in the fish that eat it, being biomagnified. And this is why eating fish that are high in mercury levels can have a huge effect on people, because the mercury levels are biomagnified. World hunger, only about 10% of the energy captured by one trophic level is available to the next. So more people could be fed and less land would be used if we adopt a largely or exclusively vegetarian diet. And this is a great video on energy flow. So if we look at carnivore versus herbivore producers, if we look at a totally grain, they can feed about 10 humans. Whereas if someone is a carnivore who eats meat, the cow itself has to first grow and it will eat these 20,000 calories grown by the producers to make a cow. And then we eventually can only feed one human with that cow over the course of maybe not a lifetime, but several years. So then we have several chemical cycles. These are biogeochemical cycles where materials move through a series of transfers from living to non-living systems and back again in recurring pathways. And I'll let you guys look through here. This is the photosynthesis cycle. Energy flows through the ecosystem. Producers create the glucose, which supplies nutrients to primary consumers, decomposers. Energy lost as heat. The water cycle, I'll let you guys kind of work through this one on your own. This is the big one where water comes to land as precipitation and then back to the atmosphere as it evaporates from transpiration in plants. So here's a great look at the water, also called the hydrologic cycle. If we're really getting picky about detailed names, it's really should be called the hydrologic cycle. So here's a look at the hydrologic cycle: precipitation on land, runoff, and then evaporation back into the air. The carbon cycle is also extremely important. It moves from the environment into living things and back to the environment. And carbon is kind of one of the main molecules of life because every living organism needs it to build the molecules of life, which are proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and nucleic acids. Carbon dioxide is removed from the environment. Producers will use it during photosynthesis. So plants and trees are very important at removing carbon from the atmosphere. This is why we don't want to cut down too many trees. And then carbon is returned to the atmosphere as CO2 during cellular respiration, and that's the exhaling with organisms. Some carbon is delayed before returning to the environment, so it'll be found in the wood of trees, limestone, or fossil fuels. And 3 processes release carbon from these long-term storage sites: decomposition, erosion, and combustion. Human activities like burning of fossil fuels and deforestation increase levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and this can lead to the warming of the atmosphere or increased acidity of oceans. So this is a look at a video of the carbon dioxide cycle. Here's just a picture of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, things like from human activities that produce carbon and what things will store carbon. The nitrogen cycle is one not as well known, but it's the principal constituent of several molecules needed for life, including proteins and nucleic acids. So nitrogen is very important for proteins and making your DNA, RNA. It's often in short supply to living systems. The largest reservoir is in the atmosphere, which is 79% nitrogen gas. So when we're breathing in air, most of that air that we're breathing in is actually nitrogen, not oxygen, which we need oxygen too, but there's not nitrogen makes up the majority of it. I'll let you read through nitrogen fixation and nitrification, and I'll let you continue kind of studying the nitrogen cycle on your own. As again, I'm trying to keep these lectures short, just to make sure people are listening to them. Human activities in the nitrogen cycle, we'll talk briefly about this. Burning of fossil fuels adds nitrogen dioxide to the atmosphere, which can react with water, and this will form acid, and this can fall as acid rain. Sunlight can also cause hydrocarbons and nitrogen dioxide to form, kind of photochemical smog. And this is a video about the nitrogen cycle. Then we have a phosphorus cycle, which cycles between rocks and living organisms. This is important because phosphorus is important in genetic material DNA, ATP, phospholipids, and vertebrate bones and teeth. This is a look at the phosphorus cycle. Eutrophication, are disruptions to the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, can cause this. Eutrophication is the enrichment of water in lakes or ponds by nutrients. It can be caused if fertilizer runs off into these bodies of water. It can lead to dramatic increases in photosynthetic organisms, and it eventually may kill fish through depletion of oxygen. So these photosynthetic little organism guys love the extra fertilizer, but they will cause an extreme kind of blossom or bloom in the water, which will kill off nutrients that other fish might need because they're using too much oxygen. Biodiversity includes the number of species living in a given area and the abundance of each. It's decreasing globally, especially in critical areas, and habitat destruction is usually responsible for that, whether it's deforestation, overfishing, building of roads. So human disturbances may lead to changes in biodiversity, which could lead to species richness. Mass extinctions are loss of many species. They have occurred in the past, but never before because of humans. Scientists estimate that we're losing species at the rate of 100 per day. Causes for loss of biodiversity, again, include habitat destruction, alien species that are brought in, over exploitations of the land. Why should we care about the loss of biodiversity? Genetic diversity is useful for crossbreeding and genetic engineering. Plants can provide new drugs and pharmaceuticals, and all the organisms are very critical to the properly functioning biogeochemical cycles. So from this chapter, you should be able to describe this, and we just have one chapter to go. Take care, guys.